Okay, I'm going to start talking about sound localization. So I'm going to start this today. I plan to finish it on Friday if I don't finish it today, and then we will talk about visual attention, and I think we'll be caught up. So if you remember, at the basilar membrane in the cochlea, that really only encodes frequency and amplitude. And I've already asked this question of, well, how do we figure out timbre? Well, how do we locate sound? This is a really different situation than what we saw with vision, with the eyes and the retina. And I think Goldstein's picture shows that really well, that if the bird is tweeting and it's up high, it's hitting the retina, low on the retina. The cat is down low, mewing, and it's hitting high on the retina, and of course the tree is in between, and that spatial information is really encoded on the retina in that kind of retinotopic map. But we're ending up with a tonotopic map about frequency, and so the ear is not telling us the same kind of information very clearly, that the bird is up high and the cat is down low. And in fact, we have to figure this out in our brains. So for sound localization, we can think of our three-dimensional map of the world that we live in, that there is the azimuth, which is the horizontal from left to right, the elevation, which is our vertical, the up and down, and the distance, which is our depth, how far something is away from us. I'm not going to talk much here about distance at all, as I feel like, well, the authors that I've seen don't talk about distance at all, but I feel like a lot of that is rather top down, and what we know about sounds and how loud or quiet they are and how maybe muffled they are, that we get that kind of distance information. What we're going to talk about are the horizontal plane, so the azimuth, and I'm going to start with that, and then we're going to talk about the vertical plane, so the elevation of sounds. He took this out of the book, but I really liked this, and I think it takes place at NASA. It's in an old edition of the book that I think it's really cool, though, that each of those little circles there is a speaker, and so they're equidistant from the participants, and they could test really specifically, horizontally and vertically, how well we can localize sounds. And we're really best at sounds that are in front of us, or pretty far off to the side. But once we get, as we get into those different angles to the side, it gets a little bit tricky. But as we get behind us and to the side, it gets extremely difficult for us. I'm going to start by talking, we're talking about the azimuth, and I'm going to start by talking about these binaural cues to sound localization. Bi meaning two, oral meaning ears, meaning this requires both ears. And I used to, when I first started teaching this class, and I wasn't really concerned about getting through all the material, we actually never talked about maybe touch, pain, taste, and smell, but those have become some of my favorite topics. I used to do this in my class, this kind of quote lab, even though it was really just a demonstration of high frequency sounds, low frequency sounds, and other people with me would walk between the students and make the sound, whether it was a whistle or whatever, and students would try to see where those sounds came from. And just one time in all of those years, I had somebody with no hearing in her left ear, and she did very poorly on everything in the azimuth. So exactly. So this requires both ears, as these are binaural cues to sound localization. We are looking at interoral differences, so differences between the two ears, where we're comparing the information that's coming in from the two ears in those subcortical structures in the brain, so in the superior olive and in the inferior colliculus. So sounds that are off to one side, and I'm pointing off to my right here, but you can kind of do this snapping off to one side and think about the fact that that is going to, if you're doing that with your right arm, your right hand, that's arriving at your right ear earlier than at your left ear, and it's louder in your right ear than in your left ear. So our interoral time difference, so the time difference between the two ears, compares the time of arrival at those two ears. And so if something's at point A, that's going to be hitting my two ears at the same time. And if something's at point B, anywhere off really to the side of A, it's going to hit the, in this case, because they're showing the right ear, it's going to hit the right ear before the left ear. And our ears are sensitive to within microseconds of difference. So now this is, we've talked about milliseconds as thousandths of a second. Microseconds are like a millionth of a second. So we're very sensitive. Our brain is very sensitive at these interoral differences. These are prominent at low frequencies. I really only remember that by starting with the interoral level difference, which I'm going to go through, and then saying these time differences and level differences or intensity differences, they're prominent at different frequencies. So I really work backwards because that isn't something I remember very easily. And this is occurring in the superior olive, and we will see research on this in a little while. So interoral level differences compares the intensity at the two different ears, where something that's happening, like again, if you snap your finger with your right hand, that is louder in your right ear than in your left ear. These are prominent at high frequencies, and this picture is why I work my way backwards, because our head acts as an acoustic shadow for those high frequencies, and this shows it really well. Comparing the boat to the little weeds. So if, because we've done this comparison with those waves in the water before, where if in this case the boat is larger and those waves are smaller, what's going to happen when those waves hit that boat is they're going to kind of spread out, and we're not going to see them as clearly on the other side of the boat. It's acting kind of like a shadow, which you might call it that, but our head acts like an acoustic shadow for those high frequency sounds in that kind of way. Whereas if we look at the weeds in the water, those waves, even though they're the same distance apart as the above picture, they are going around those weeds, and so the weeds don't really break apart those waves. And the same with our head for those low frequency sounds. If you can kind of imagine the waveform going over and around our head as we have these low frequency sounds, our head doesn't act as an acoustic shadow in quite the same way. So interoral level differences prominent at high frequencies, interoral time differences prominent at low frequencies. And here's another graphic that shows how those intensity differences are more noticeable for the higher frequencies. As you remember, that low A on the piano is 27.5. We hear down to 20 hertz, but up until even about 100, let's say almost 500 hertz, the intensity differences aren't making a large difference. And then you can see that as we move 10 degrees over to the right, 45 degrees, 90 degrees, so absolutely over to the right of to our right ear, that those intensity differences are for those higher frequencies are getting greater and greater, which we take that information in and calculate that in our brain to say this is coming over, absolutely to our right versus 45 degrees to our right, and so forth. So again, those binaural cues to sound localization require both ears. They are binaural, meaning two ears. We are comparing what's happening at the two ears. And on average, people can localize sounds directly in front of them most accurately. And we get worse as we get to the sides, and especially behind our heads, we get less and less accurate. As I said when I showed the picture of all the speakers that were equidistant. We also have something called the cone of confusion, and he has a great picture in the book that they don't give me in the PowerPoint slides from the publishers, but it's this woman, and it's showing that off to say, like, let's say something is 90 degrees to my right, whether that is, about 20 degrees up in elevation or straight out to my right or 20 degrees down in elevation, I have this kind of cone of confusion of I can't really tell based on those binaural differences where that sound is coming from. So he provides this idea of the cone of confusion really when we have a particular place along the azimuth and differences in elevation, and especially if they're kind of close to each other. To some extent, we answer this with this monaural cue for elevation. So monaural meaning one ear. We just use one ear. We just need one ear to tell us about elevation. And it is a spectral cue. So if you remember, I'm not sure I really said this clearly enough, but those different frequencies, when we're talking about the harmonics of a complex tone, that we talk about as the sound spectrum. So we have this spectrum of sound, these different frequencies, and they're going to have a different distribution depending on the exact location, especially what we're going to talk about in elevation. And part of this spectral cue is it depends on the reflections of the pinna. Okay, and we're all going to have our own reflections from each other. So what they did in this study that is being shown, the figure on the right, is they put a microphone inside the person's ear and they played these broadband sounds from about 4,000 hertz to about 9,000 hertz. It included all of those sounds. And then they measured what is the amplitude of each of these frequencies. And as you can see, 15 degrees elevation above had the spectral cue that's in blue. So those different frequencies had those different amplitudes. And 15 degrees below, when they played the sound there, they had the spectral cue that's shown in red. So those are the amplitudes for the different frequencies. And it's really quite incredible. We're taking all this information in and we're figuring out the location of sounds in elevation, in the sense of the vertical world. We also have the skull blocks, and so if things get kind of over our heads, that gives us information as well. But a lot of this monaural cue is from the reflections of the pinna, creating these unique disruptions in the sound waves. And if you think about it, most of our sounds are made up of multiple frequencies, but it's not just this overall broad spectrum sound. As my voice is probably somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 hertz, maybe getting a little bit lower in some of those frequencies. But if I'm off to one side, you're gonna hear that, and if I'm above you, you're gonna be able to tell as I get a certain amount above or below. So we use this monaural cue for elevation based on the reflections of our pinna, and I'm going to show this in a study by Hoffman et al. Where you can see at the very top what they are doing is playing tones at each of those. What they're trying to show is that if you look at the box with those intersections, they're playing tones at those intersections, and that people are pretty good. So the red dots are the estimations. They're a teeny bit off along the azimuth, but they're pretty good at elevation. And for some of those places along the azimuth, they're also very good. And so they test them first, and then they put this clay thing in their ear so that they're really not using the reflections of their pinna at all. And you can see that there's certain holes in it, so it's got its own reflections. And at first, at day 0, they retest them after putting this clay thing in their ear so that they don't have those reflections from the pinna. And you can see that they're about the same place along the azimuth, but elevation, they have no idea, and they're just kind of guessing there at the bottom. They have no idea along elevation. I can't really see the days, but I think it's day 5. It's spreading out a little bit. They're getting a little bit better. By day 19, they're pretty close to their original, how they were doing with their own pinna. Now with this clay thing in their ear, they're pretty close. And just so you see post after they take the clay out with their own pinnae, they're back to normal. So really, what was happening with this new clay thing acting as a new pinnae, they were making new correlations in their brains in order to figure out where sounds were located along the vertical plane. This is fascinating to me, and what this kind of means is, so you could lop off my ear, what is seen of my ear, put on your ear onto my head, right? Or vice versa, cut off your ear, put my ear onto your head. And at first, you might not be able to really tell the elevation of sound very well, but you're going to get better and better, and you're going to kind of create these new correlations for where along the vertical plane those sounds are. So I'm going to tell a little story on myself that's going to show maybe how unempathetic I can be, which I feel like I'm an empathetic person, but sometimes I think I lack thinking through. And I actually thought about this a long time before I asked my colleague. So I had a colleague who fell down a flight of stairs, and she busted up her nose so badly that they had to take the cartilage from her ear to fix her nose. Okay, so it was pretty bad. And of course, I was teaching sensation and perception, and I was wondering. I said, "Well, did you have a little problem for a while locating sounds?" So she said to me, "Well, really, I was in so much pain, and there was so much going on, and there was so much changes. I don't remember at all." Well, that makes sense. It's a terrible situation, and my scientific kind of curiosity was not very driven by empathy, but but yes, I'm sure it did happen that she had problems locating sounds for a little while as they changed her pinna. I think it was just one ear, but still, that's gonna change things. Okay, I think I'm going to end just a little teeny bit early today with this summary slide, because I think if I do the physiology next, that gets into a whole new sort of bunch of ideas that kind of go together. I think I can still do visual attention and then be where we need to be on Monday. So I'm just going to summarize these auditory cues for localization, that along the azimuth on the horizontal plane, we use interaural level differences. And if you're reading at all in this field for this, for your project or whatever, they will call them ILDs a lot, interaural level differences for the high frequencies, interaural time differences or ITDs for the low frequencies. And for elevation, we're really using a spectral cue. It's a monaural cue. We really only need the one ear, as long as that's kind of on that side of the azimuth that tells us, that's then going to tell us about elevation. And it's really because of the specific folds of our pinnae are producing the specific spectral cue that we experience. This use of cues is not as accurate as our retinas in providing information about location. So I very often end up coming back to this idea of bird watching, because I live out in the country, and I don't know how often you've heard the birds in the background. I know you've heard the motorcycles, pretty sure, but I do a bit of bird watching, and I listen for them. And it's not until really they move, as we'll talk about movement maybe, that you can see the birds, but the auditory information only gets you so close. I mean, you have to, and especially like woodpeckers, they're really hard to find. So you know they're kind of coming over from a certain direction, but exactly where they are in elevation, and I have a lot of little trees, that exactly what tree they're on is not very clear. Whereas if you see something on your retina, like you see the bird move, you know exactly where it is. So it's not providing that quite that accurate information as our retinas do. I sometimes show one of the brain games that is about, watch this, that one, which if you get a chance to, it's about 50 minutes long, and they have lots of visual stuff and lots of animations, and lots of scientists come on and talk. But one of the things they show us is a man who can localize. He's blind and he can localize using like he makes this sound, and he points his head around and uses those, and he moves his head. So another thing we do when we're trying to figure out where sounds are coming from is typically we move our head a bit. We cock our head from one side to the other or up and down a little bit to give us a better idea of sound localization, but it's not as quick and accurate as our retinas for those of us who can see. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and it's a teeny bit early today, but I think this is good, and we'll finish up with auditory localization or sound localization on Friday, and finish up also with visual attention.